Now, I would like to introduce the first speaker of the session, Dr. Neena Gupta Vij. She is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Central University of Jammu, Jammu and Kashmir. She has worked in the area of gender and feminist studies for her PhD research. Her research interests include contemporary women's writing in India and English translation, translation studies, American literature, Afro American writings, Native American and Chicano literature, and diaspora studies. Currently, she is working on Indian myths, mythology, and autobiographies. She is a member of the Shakespeare Association India, IACLALS, Indian Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, and EFSLE India, the Ecosophical Foundation for the Study of Literature and Environment. Ma'am, I'd request you to start the session.
Good evening, and it's
Good evening, ma'am.
such a pleasure to be associating with old friends on a formal portal like this. And I can see a lot of my former colleagues with whom we work together, we've learned together, and it's a pleasure. I thank the the Academy, for giving me this opportunity, and I thank all the organizers, conveners for giving me this opportunity. I'm very grateful, and I'm sure I'm going to enjoy the session. So I would like to share the screen if that's okay.
Yes, ma'am, please.
I shall do it myself.
Yes, ma'am, you can use
Okay.
that present now option.
Yeah, I do that. Yes. So when Dr. Shubhra was asking me what it is that I would like to talk about, I just thought that right now we are going through a lot of upheaval and rethinking literary studies, rethinking life, rethinking planet. So maybe we should just sort of reiterate the fields that we have gone through, the kind of things that we have gone through in literature. And so this overview sort of reacquaints us with the entire current of theory, criticism, literary studies in the Western Hemisphere. So I would like to begin a little rehash of classical criticism. And while we're all familiar with Plato and Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus, it is important to note that it is with classical criticism that the spirit of inquiry begins in the logocentric world of Greek classical learning. And here it is a kind of a formal opening. It's a formal opening of a door into the wonders of learning, which till now and sitting in our homes we are enjoying and we are learning and we are trying to cope with. So Plato's most important idea was ideal forms. And even now, when we look at literary theory today, we are still, wrestling with the idea whether the world is phenomenal or noumenal, ideal or real. Even now, we have theories, we have religious theories, we have cultural theories, which sort of engage with this question whether what is happening with us is real, are our bodies real, are our experiences real, or is it all an illusion? So I tend to equate Plato and his thought a little with the thought of Krishna, because Plato also believes that the real world is an imitation, and it is not the real world, the material world. And so Krishna in the Gita also says that all the world is an illusion, and what is happening is in the other world. So in that sense, it's not as if the Western world is very far apart from ours, because we have to understand that knowledge travels over centuries, over space and time, and it sort of tends to coalesce and come together, cohere together, to form new fronts, new imaginative fronts. Now Aristotle, the theory of mimesis right up till now, when he says that the art is supposed to mimic life, imitate life, he is asserting the importance of representational art, representational form, which till today we are seeking to work with. What are we representing? Are we representing people, ideals, forms? And here, of course, Plato says that imitation is bad because it's thrice removed from reality. But Aristotle puts mimesis as a very important part of the human experience. Horace and Longinus, as we know in the Roman tradition, have taken these ideas further, and rather than giving any philosophical inquiry on the same, they have focused more on the technical part, the language, and the beautification. So, with the classical criticism, we come to a space in critical or in literary studies where some rules are set for the evaluation of art and literature. And this came to the Western Hemisphere. This Greek Roman learning came to England and through Italy, Spain in the Renaissance. So this reawakening is what we are connected with. Renaissance is the beginning of the modernism, the pre-modern world, and we find that in Sir Philip Sidney and his defense of poetry, he says that Plato, when he banished the poets, was not really against poetry, it was against the abuse of poetry, and therefore he reinstates poetry as a very important part of human experience. And Elizabethan poetics is all set. So, why is this important for our research? Because it's always better to know the basics from where we come. Now, here you see the university wits, as we understand today. University is the place where Greek and Latin was taught, where the classical arts were taught. And obviously, the university wits, all of them, Dean, Peel, and all, they were, uh, immersed in learning, in formal learning. So their work was more imitative in nature. They would take up the classical examples and try to write in the same way. Even Ben Jonson did that. So that's the comparison between Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. He also followed the unities set by Aristotle, and he also tried to make his plays conform to classical traditions. But Shakespeare was a newcomer, and today what we call an original. He looked at everything, he saw everything, but then he played with it. He tended to add his own self into it. He put his own age into it. So when we look at any literary work, we have to understand, uh, if we are looking at biographical criticism or we're looking at people or contextual criticism, then we do benefit by understanding where the words of the author are coming from. So Shakespeare gives us originality, gives a lot of creativity because he does not follow rules. Now, one very important aspect of this is the revenge tragedy. The university wits had the Oedipus trilogy. Then they had the tragedy or the Greek tragedies and the revenge tragedies. But Shakespeare modified it into Hamlet. And the Jacobean poets like Webster, or dramatists like Webster, turned it into even more of a gory kind of a revenge tragedy. So from Kid to Shakespeare to Jacobean like Webster, we find that there is a gradual evolution even within the same decades. So, what is the contribution to the critical trends? That we find that in literature, in English literature, which is coming into its own, the local is going towards glory, towards a glorious past, as they find in the classical tradition, because it gives them something more grand to look at. And again, there is a movement from theological perspective to humanism. Renaissance is the movement for humanism. And as Hamlet puts it so beautifully, man is the and Pope also says later, the perfect study of man is man. What a noble creation of God is man, as Hamlet says. So the focus has shifted from God to man. Man again as a creation of God. So, but the focus is different. And a very, very important change which happens is that because between Plato and the Renaissance, there is a whole 1,000 years of religious um, empiricism. There is, imperialism. There is the Roman Catholic Roman Empire, which has taken over the world. And so the world of letters is dominated by religion, theology, and debates of about the gospels. There is interpretation and all those the scholastics and all. So Renaissance becomes very refreshing because it brings a change to the secular. Now, whenever we move through the ages, we find these currents of thought about form, about idea, about ideal, about religion, about secularism, about the local, about the past. This thread carries on. I would like you to concentrate, on this. Again, the classical, just as the Renaissance was experimenting with everything, it was experimenting with form and with the individual, with the human being as the center of the universe. The neoclassical tradition now again went back to form because in order to put content in a way that you are able to access it, to enjoy it, you need a good form. And English literature did not really have very much forms. They were still borrowing from Europe. So the restoration, Dryden is the critic, and Dryden gives you his own ideas about classicism and how people should not write impromptu. Then Alexander Pope, who's so rule conscious, and Samuel Johnson, who is the bridge between classicism and Shakespeare. He says that while Shakespeare does not follow the classical rules, yet there is some originality, and that originality is what is Englishness. So it is, gradually this thread of creating your own national literature, at the same time borrowing what you want, but adding your own character into it. The most important aspect of neoclassical the age is the rise of prose, the rise of the middle class, the rise of trade, the rise of exploration of new areas. Stories are coming from all over the world, and all these are giving rise to a lot of um, tales, a lot of new wondrous tales about the real world. So the novel rises out of the ashes of the romance. Romance was the tales of the fantastic, of the past, of magical creatures, and there was a little lack of reality there. But the novel is steeped in realism. So with neoclassicism, it's rule and it's decorum. Decorum is very important in neoclassical literature. There is, you imitate nature, the form, and reason. It is also the age of enlightenment. So reason is gradually asserting itself, which is why prose comes up. And now the reasoning mind cannot accept creatures that you cannot see in the daytime. So empiricism is asserting itself, and your experience is based on your perception. So the things that you cannot see or feel or hear, you do not want to believe in them, which is what gives rise to realism. And decorum, the appropriate. Propriety is a very important word in the 18th century. What is right? What is the correct form? What is the correct dress? What is the correct form of a dress for a lady? What is the correct way to sit? Which is the correct carriage to drive? Which is the correct drink to have? Which is the correct food to have? So the whole life revolves around decorum. Now, when we go through this thread, I'm sure all of you have gone through. I'm just going through it again to sort of reshuffle the whole thing. The one age carries in itself the antithesis of its major ideas. The thread carries on, and somehow in the next age, that thread becomes more dominant. So while nature that was discussed in your classical age was human nature, and nature as it pertained to man, not nature in itself or by itself. Its relationship to man was important. So in that sense, we find that romantic criticism moved away a little from form and wanted to now concentrate on content, and also wanted to change the content. Romanticism and the rise of realism in neoclassical age are a tribute to the movement of democracy. Already we are moving in a political and social realm, we are moving away from the attention to the monarchs and the legendary figures, to gods, and we are moving towards the common man. And romanticism, because of the French Revolution, because of the Sturm und Drang movement in Germany, because of German idealism also, and because of all these movements that are happening in Europe, there is this move towards equality, fraternity, and liberty. So the whole the 18th century, moving towards the 19th century, 100 years of tumult because of enlightenment. You have discovered the human mind, and now you want to experiment with that human mind. At the same time, the industrial revolution has come in, and people who were used to finding vast stretches of land unspoiled by any smoke or any debris is now finds acres of land taken over by debris, and there's so much pollution, and it's gradually increasing, and the way of life is changing. So romantic literature as well as criticism is oriented towards an anti-urban stance, an anti-industrial stance also. So because of this, you move towards nature. Just as when we are in school, we love a picnic. I remember college times and all. We love a picnic outside the city. You just want to be outside among the trees and the rivers, and we are lucky to have all that in around Jammu. So you want to change there. Now you want to look at beauty because the ugliness of the industries and the factories is bothering you. Also, the neoclassical age was an age of decorum in which you just said what is the right thing, but you suppressed your emotions. So emotions. Now the question of truth from Plato's time till ours carries on. I mean, everybody's experimenting and trying to know the truth, but for every age, for every critic, for every author, the truth remains different. And this is, of course, an age of creativity. Now, individualism is a very important aspect of literature, right from neoclassical age also, because there's a growth of the individual from humanism to the fact that the world is centered or made for the individual. And with Reformation, with this Reformation in the Catholic Church, when Protestantism grows, the focus is again on the personal relationship of God and man, and not with the community as large. So you are able to assert your individualism. Another very important aspect of romantic criticism is the the idea of genius, which is just emerging. That there are certain people who are born with some innate imagination. So we find in the poetry and the writings, even the preface of Coleridge and Wordsworth, the idea of trying to celebrate the common beauty, because that common, it's not just that you suddenly lift your eyes and you find that, oh, I've not seen the trees. It's because of the contrast that the urban landscape is creating for the ordinary people. When they go to the cities, they find a different kind of um, a life and a different kind of looks which they don't like. So they turn towards nature's beauty as a kind of a support, as succor. So it is in this sense that we have to look at romantic literature and their search for beauty in older forms. So this is the age of nostalgia also, but this is an age which is passing, as we find. Coming at this juncture when we are fighting for the survival of the planet, we know that these are all movements which were trying to assert the importance of nature, but we have somehow never managed to do it. We're going further and further away from it. The Victorian was, of course, a very turning point in the history, not only of England, of English literature, but of the entire world, because of the explorations, because of the sea routes, because of the formation of colonies, and England has become an empire. Queen Victoria is the empress. So there's a poetry of celebration, but there is also Robert Browning and Elizabeth Browning who are writing long romantic poems. But it's also a dialogue about the self, about the sharing of the self. Then there is also a very strong religious strain, as we find in Hopkins. Lord Tennyson is the poet laureate, and he glorifies adventure through his Ulysses, the spirit of adventure of touring the seas, the high seas, and discovering new lands, and stopping at every land. And somewhere you are lotus eating, somewhere you are moving on. So this is a kind of a glorious age for England. They are just enriching themselves because they are masters of the world. In prose, we find there's Ruskin and Carlyle, Cardinal Newman, and Matthew Arnold. So there is also the movement of religion, religiosity, and faith. At the same time, there is a move away from religion because of Darwin's theory of evolution. Because of industrialization, we find Marx turning again in nostalgia towards an age when man and his labor were not alienated. Man, whatever he made, he was owner of the product that he made. But in the industrial age, he was not the owner of his labor. So it is again this contrast between the earlier age of rural um, guild system and rural artisans and the industrial factory workers that is making that contributed to his making his economic theory. And by the end of this century of the Victorian age, we come to Freud, who is now taking Darwin as concentrated on the body, and Freud is now concentrating on the mind. With the Enlightenment, the concentration on the mind has come in. So this is one of the very important junctures of human history for literary studies, for research, for the growth of theory and criticism. At the same time, the novel grows because this is more and more an age of reason, and novel becomes more social criticism. From realism, it is now criticism because Dickens finds that the imagination of the romantic age is disappearing, and there is Jeremy Bentham who talks about utilitarianism, and in fact, very famously in Hard Times, Charles Dickens is able to say that what do these people want? They say that you cannot have a wallpaper with horses on it because horses, it's not real. You cannot have a carpet of daisies inside because you cannot trample them underfoot. So what kind of world are they creating for us to live? And education is becoming so commercialized that you cannot teach people exactly what they need to learn. So is of course Charles Dickens is of course a very representative author who is able to see the decline or the change basically in the lifestyle, and for future generations it is very important because education brings in democracy in a very big way. It is ultimately this education which comes to colleges, comes to each and every person, and which is what we are fighting for even today, education for all. That comes with the Victorian age, and that it is the education which is going to break the class structure which is so prominent in England. And Hippolyte Taine is the person who talks about race, milieu, and moment in the Victorian age, which is when you start concentrating on um, the writer as a person who lives within a certain context. So again, when writers write, they are writing within a context, but sometimes they want to move away from the context and only concentrate on the text, on the words. So this tussle between text and context carries on even now. What is more important? The words on the page, the poem in itself, or where the author is coming from, where the reader is coming from? So these are some of the questions that we carry into research even now. As I said, with every age there is a counter movement. So aestheticism, because Victorianism is very real. Victorian age is very full of realism and satire. So as a kind of counter culture, counter movement, we have art for art's sake, we have pre-Raphaelism, and we have a very strong religious movement also. While Darwin's theory of evolution is creating skepticism about the story of the Genesis, about the story of Adam and Eve, and the story of God making word flesh, at the same time, there is the reiteration of faith, even if it's not in the word or not in the biblical stories, but faith in the God who has created everything. And here, the Newtonian principle of a very mechanical world holds firm. So the Victorian age brings together the threads of religion, science, philosophy, and moves further into the 20th century. So when we move into the 20th century, the legacy of Victorian age that we find is imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, racialism, and the gender divide. The gender divide began a little. I mean, when you read a lot of these texts, for example, when you read Shakespeare and you look at it from a gender point of view, you find, for example, in All's Well That Ends Well, that the girls are talking about disguising themselves as men and then playing the fool and having a lot of courtship and enjoying themselves in the forest, and not really bothered about the truth of the court. But the minute come outside, come back into the court, they are taking husbands with them. And the last part, the epilogue to the that play is um, is the song that now we are going to be wed and now we have to be serious. We cannot be playing the fool like this any longer. And so let this be a beautiful interlude in our lives. So if you think of it today, it is exactly like the bachelor's party that the men and women are throwing when they get married. That you understand that marriage is the great dividing line between the life that you had earlier and the life that you're going to have now. But in the Victorian times, we are able to see that this has created a gender divide. The roles of the male and the female, the role of God, king, man, despite having a woman as a ruler, are very, very strong. And the role of the woman is very subservient. And this is there in all docility. If you even Jane Austen is saying that the very fiery Elizabeth towards the end says, "Yeah, yes, I will call you Mr. Darcy, even when we are married." So that coyness, that the fact that you are going to be tamed now after your marriage, all your wildness was before you were married. That is something that the age is emphasizing. It is becoming part of the formal structure of the lives of people. So before we come to the modern age and we, sort of understand that how the Victorian has changed into the modern, there are two or three philosophers. There is Kant and there is Rousseau, then there is Nietzsche. It is with the philosophy of these three people that we enter the modern world, along with, of course, Darwin, Marx, and Freud, who have given us their specific theories after studying the world. So Kant is the person who has tried to understand the rational world of the Enlightenment and try to marry the mind that inquires, the reason that wants to know why things happen, and the reason that should lead you forward into leading a good life. So he believes that rationalism is good. Rationality is what is going to move us forward, and it is going to take us away from all that is evil or bad in us. But then at the same time, they're not ready to leave the world of ideas, the world of ideals, the world of. And here I would just like to experiment with a thought, of which I'm convinced, but maybe you're not, that idea and God, and the ideal is perfection, and God is perfection. So if you've thought of it like that, that God is also the same. God is an idea that we are working with. God is the perfect idea towards whom we are moving. So Kant is also not ready to leave that ideal form of Plato. And he tries to marry the material, the rational, and the faith to his philosophy of two worlds, the nominal world and the phenomenal world. Rousseau, he is coming to enlightenment. Enlightenment comes when Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." And then Locke says that that's not precisely true. You must also experience life with your senses. So we human beings are now caught between a faith, which is an idea in our mind, then the mind, which thinks, and thirdly, a mind which also experiences through perception. So these three ideas we are taking with us, and we're not sure which is the predominant idea. We don't know which way to turn, what is right, what is wrong, and all the authors are struggling with the same dilemma in one way or the other. George Eliot is writing about the same thing. How treated in her long Mill on the Floss. Also, there are so many.
Excuse me,
Yes,
can you your presentation and slide is gone? Can
it's
you
gone.
reshare that, ma'am?
I just a minute. Yes. Uh, Tell me. Yes. What is the problem? Can you see me?
Ma'am, we can see you. Actually, your presentation, that page is gone. Your on your
Okay.
screen, the screen is showing. The Google Meet is showing, not the presentation.
Now,
Yes, ma'am, we can see it. Can you make it on full screen?
yeah, yeah,
It's very small.
it's come.
Yeah, we can see it.
I think must be just a little lack of connection somewhere.
Yes, ma'am.
Hmm. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, where was I? That's very important. So we are caught in this dilemma between mind and experience and faith. And then enlightenment is taking us towards the mind, which, along with humanism and along with Reformation, is now moving us more into individualism, more towards our own selves and our own destinies as masters of our own destinies. And there is this tussle, where does God fit into all this? And also, enlightenment brings us to a more democratic, to a more equal status, to man as being equal to man. So there are Rousseau, who is there. I mean, he's supposed to be a romantic, but he's called a romantic precisely because he says that where will this development and where will this progress? And when, okay, you have a mind, so you get educated. So the educated mind is now going to say that I'm superior, and the uneducated mind is going to be inferior. You have a degree in, in Latin and Greek, and the others don't have a degree, so you're going to think that you're superior. So he says that this enlightenment, instead of giving us equality, might even create more inequality. So the debate in any one age is never one-sided. That's the beauty of theory, of understanding literature in terms of theory, that every author is caught up in a dilemma, and each text is an answer to that dilemma. And it's not an answer really, it's a kind of an attempt to answer. They're caught up in the questions, and they all attempt to answer. So George Eliot is also trying to answer the same old questions, that the gender divide, are women really not equal to men despite the mind? I'll come to that again later. Because the modern world has all these problems now. America has become free, France is a republic again, England is facing world wars. So, and the class structure is breaking down. The king is no longer, or the queen is no longer so important. And all the colonies, they are very rich, but there's a lot of problem in all the colonies. Japan is against you. You can see the rise of other powers. So many of the authors in the modern times, as a lot of critics say, they have escaped into the literary. And this escape in the literary means, like Virginia Woolf says, that you have to delineate experience not clearly, but like the nebula, like it has the whole nebula of experience should be written down, not very clear cut. Like realism tries to say, for example, realism says that there were 3 cows in the field, and so authors like Joyce and Virginia Woolf and Eliot say that there's no need to write all the hard figures. The point is just to say that there is a shadow and the grass is going. So that is something like the impressionistic paintings that were there, that the grass is disappearing, and maybe there is something that is eating it. So you're not supposed to say that there are any cows anywhere eating, but you're just supposed to imply that maybe there is. So there is, you're escaping into the mind, more and more into the mind. And so the text and the form become very important. And we see in the beginning of the 20th century that all these movements come together. Formalism comes up in Russia, in the whole area of East Asia. Structuralism comes up in France. New criticism comes up in America, and then it comes to England. So all over the world, we are turning towards the text. So the most important problem for any scholar is sometimes to understand this thing, and I'm very grateful to my own supervisor, Professor Rampal, who was always engaging with this question. And sometimes in some discussion, very clear to me that when the times are in transition, when there is a lot of struggle going on, then the intellectuals tend to escape, because intellectuals they need a lot of peace to work. And when all the people who are activists, when times need activism or a lot of strident politics, the intellectuals don't know where to go. Intellectuals create ideas, and the idea needs a little peace and quiet and a little time to grow. Nevertheless, the intellectuals are doing their job at this time, and the ideas are coming. Like there's Kant, who's trying to marry belief and mind. There is Rousseau. There are the German idealists who are doing again looking at all these things. But there are so many threats, and there are so many upheavals in the world, that finally you just sort of escape into the text, trying to find the right words for a new experience. So with the modernism, or the modern literature, must be studied as a kind of a cross-cultural thread. A lot of cross-cultural threads coming together to weave a fabric which later the post-structuralists are going to call a text. The psychoanalytical criticism, because of Freud, is coming up. Now, psychoanalytical criticism is very important because it is the men who lived with their bodies I think women will agree even now. And the women who escape into the spirit and the mind. So Freud's experiments and all his cases are to do with women who are neurotic, and he's talking about dreams. So women, especially of leisure, who had no real work to do and had no, they were not given any occupation. They could read a little, but they were not given any importance. But now becoming neurotics. Even Eliot has very written about in the Wasteland. So these neurotic women, even, I mean, I remember that when I was turning into my 40s, I had gone to a doctor once and I said that I have a lot of aches and pains. And he looked at me and sort of understood that I must be at that age. And he says, ma'am, you must take a little to meditation. And I laughed because it reminded me so much of Freud. So men sometimes do not know what to do with women who are free, and they come to them with their troubles and say, I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know what to do with myself. So this is again a very important moment for the feminist movement, because even men begin to understand that if women have a mind, the mind needs to be engaged. Otherwise, they'll get neurotic. So the stream of consciousness is also an offshoot of psychoanalysis. Then there is social criticism, economic, political, social norms come together. So we have Marxist criticism, feminist criticism, then we have the growth of cultural studies in the 60s. So from the 20s, we are moving gradually, and all these movements are gathering a lot of momentum. And for the feminism, for feminists, Terry Eagleton, like Simone de Beauvoir, has said that woman is the opposite, the other of man. She is non-man, defective man, assigned a chiefly negative value in relation to the male first principle. But equally, man is what he is only by virtue of ceaselessly shutting this other or opposite, defining himself in antithesis to it. And so the othering or the binary opposition of man and woman, which has been set forth in the Genesis itself, but the interpretation of the roles is different. For example, in as the black feminism said and the indigenous feminisms in India say, that woman has never been idle. It's not as if she is so tender and delicate that she cannot bear any pain or any hardship. It's just that the women of the upper classes who have not had to do any work and they have been women of leisure, that the feminism coming from the upper classes has tended to emphasize this point, that while women have a mind and they're equal to men in many ways, they're not given an equal status. So here we find it's only in the generally in the upper classes, and then it percolates down to the lower classes. And then when you find that there is a different role for men and women, and with the increasing masculinity of the world, as explorers, as settlers, as imperialists, sorry, again confusing the word, as imperialists, and as people who are conquering new worlds, as conquerors, patriarchy becomes the assertive norm in the centuries from Shakespeare to the modern age. And more patriarchal denominations come into power, so that woman finds herself at a disadvantage. Along with this, with feminism, with Marxism, and with cultural studies, we come to a very important concept which works till now, ideology. So, ideology, of course, is the whole fabric of thoughts, religious thoughts, cultural thoughts, poems, and things that we, say to one another, and even the talk that we have, the kind of literature that we read, the kind of criticism that we do, that is a superstructure which tries to keep the status quo. It grows out, but it maintains the status quo, and it generally reflects the interests of the ruling class. And I would just, briefly, one can divide sort of literature into a group of literature by the leisured classes, such as it was in the time when literature was because of patronages, as in the Renaissance or the neoclassical age. With the printing press, we find independent authors coming in, and more the middle class growing. And with the coming of education, we find more and more people who are not from the upper class or the aristocracy writing, and like people like Daniel Defoe. So, with the novel, especially, we come into a realm that the interests of the ruling class are also questioned. So ideology now becomes or text, any text, any literature becomes a site of contestation. While the ruling class is going to write about the ideas that help them, the working classes or the counter classes, the other classes are going to counter by giving them their side of the story. So we are now coming into a literature which is always in dialogue. So while Marx says that revolution cannot, without revolution, the class structure, the struggle will never go. We find that the classes, instead of clashing, are also when they are doing it in literature, they are engaging one another and they are in dialogue with one another through literature. So literature becomes a place where you are able to put your ideas, and these ideas are, as Hegel has said, thesis, antithesis, and then out of that is the synthesis. And with the dominant ideology, we come to Althusser and Gramsci. Again, he emphasized that hegemony is maintained. The hegemony of the upper classes is maintained even through education. So even the universities of the whole world, where you could have independent inquiry, somehow the other, the clash between the ruling ideology and the ideology of the others who don't agree, or those who dissent has become a very dirty word these days. So the ruling classes try to maintain hegemony. Althusser says that it is again the state apparatuses like the media, aren't we familiar with it? Like the judiciary, like so many other the official statements that come in that are that assert and keep the ideology of the ruling classes in place. And even if you are not really a ruler yourself, but you belong to a class that has always been dominating, you find that you are on the side of the dominating class. So with the modern age, we come into a very important definition. Why do we call the classical and the Renaissance until neoclassical, we call it criticism? But with the modern age and coming into the 30s, especially post Second World War, we call it theory. So earlier, literature is a kind of engagement with human experience, a writing of human experience, such as poetry or epic, telling how people live in the world and talk about people's relationship with God, or talk of people's relationship with others, and talk of people's relationship with themselves, their own dilemmas. And the critics are just looking at it and saying, oh, he's not said this properly. Why is he saying this? This is very quarrelsome. Like Plato says that poetry is going to create a lot of problem, because poets make fun of gods. They show gods as doing immoral things. So that's just criticism. It's an evaluation. And Matthew Arnold is also an evaluative critic, because of his touchstone method. He says you just put all the classics together and then you compare how a new work compares with that. So this is just an evaluation whether my work is as good as somebody else's. So there is an ideal against which our work is measured. But theory is a distinct shift. Theory is an interdisciplinary field. We are now talking philosophy. Now we are taking the philosophy of society. We are taking sociological philosophy. We are taking anthropological philosophy. We are taking linguistic philosophy. We are taking science. We are taking empiricism. We are taking quantum physics. We are taking Darwinism. We are taking all these theories, and now we are looking at literature. So when we look through the lens of Darwin, we find that Adam and Eve seems to be a very false story. When we look through the lens of religion, we find that it is a beautiful story. It's symbolic, and it tells us very simple thing in a very metaphorical way. So there are ways of looking at literature, and theory is that engagement of the entire polity of each and every man with what is being said. So as Saussure says that there is the parole and the lang. So the parole, the utterance of the individual man is very important, because where he is situated, from which position she is speaking, is important. In between modernism and postmodernism, we have existentialism, and this is another perspective through which one can see literature. We have all these authors who, again, like Kant and David Hume and like Rousseau, are again engaging with the idea of God. And Nietzsche is very, very important here. Postmodernism rests on his idea of the death of God. Now, the death of God is a very, very important aspect, which is to do the idea of the with the doing away by Nietzsche of the fact that man has to work continuously towards perfection, towards an unknown ideal. So Nietzsche, again, with Nietzsche, with existentialism, with modernism and postmodernism, again we engage with the question of Plato's ideal forms. So is man a shadow of a shadow? And is man an imitation twice removed from reality? And is he always going to be in the shadow of that one of God or the idea? So man is never perfect. Man's world is never perfect. The material world is never perfect. So in that world, idea and God are alive. Nietzsche puts it a very different way, and he says that all of man's suffering is because he tries to attain this ideal of uh, God, that I am a sinner and I have to be perfect. I have to rid of this original sin. So you're always measuring yourself against an ideal, and this ideal he calls God. And in every aspect, in every culture, there is this one perfect idea. Like we have the Radha Purushottam, or you have the idea of Mary, or you have the idea of the sun as the perfect thing, or the absolute temperature, or the Newtonian absolute numbers, So you have that absolute something against which you are measuring everything. So Nietzsche says that it is only with the death of God that man will be able to rise, because right now he's always measuring himself and finding himself short. But man is capable through his own willpower, through his own mind, of attaining much more, provided not confused about ideas like, am I measuring? So when he's unable to measure, he feels guilty, he feels ashamed, and there's a lot of suffering, and the suffering takes away all the energy that man can do to improve himself. Then when you're questioning the ideas, the linguistic turn in theory is very important, and post-structuralism, postmodernism, and all these philosophers are now saying that there is the tussle between the ideal and the real is only an idea of language. It is through language. So logocentrism, which comes in with Plato, that you have tried to create abstract facts out of concrete truths, that you have tried to make generalizations, you have tried to create philosophy out of everyday events. And this logocentrism, this language has confused everything. And second realization with Lacan and with all the with psychoanalytical critics also is that we are made by language. The world is constructed by language. So the word construct comes into being, and the biblical term word is made flesh is, again, very, very important. It is a word. You are always speaking yourself into being. So the idea of performative comes in. What are you saying? And so everything is a construct. Gender is a construct. Sexuality is a construct. Class is a construct. Idealism is a construct. Materialism is a construct. And we are always these things into being. So with this, with Foucault, we come into this understanding that all the language that is doing is trying to maintain an idea of power and knowledge. So discourse uses knowledge in order to create power for the people who have knowledge. So anybody who has knowledge creates a system in which they become powerful, and then they keep trying to maintain that system through, let's say, the ideology. But the word he uses is discourse. At the same time, Bakhtin is talking about discourse as a social, in a social sense, that all novels, all literature, all the say, everything is a discourse because it's an engagement. And that's why he uses the word monoglossia, heteroglossia, double voicedness, that the state speaks in a single voice, but people speak in many voices. So this is again, discourse is again about the ruling versus the masses. And intertextuality, that Julia Kristeva also talks about, is also about something like this, which in basic terms means that no knowledge is created. Everything is around us, and we're always trying to make sense of the reality around us. But certain people get ahead and they create a discourse, and the rest of the people are always caught in it. They're trying to live it, or they're trying to fight it. So the colonial world dissipated after the Second World War, and we have now to research into the aftermath of the colonial empires. And so we have a lot of people inquiring from the metropoles. This inquiry was not possible from the colonies. It was only possible by going to the imperial powers. So America and England, in Europe only, in the through the Eurocentric discourse only, it was possible to understand that there is a binary created between the East and the West, and there is a binary created between the white and the rest, that there is a binary created between the dominant classes and the subaltern classes. And then in all the fights of the world, in all the uh, fight for the resources of the world, in trying to grab more and more power through riches, a whole lot of older people, like the Native Americans, like the Aborigines of Australia, like the tribals of India, have been left behind. The natives of South America, whom Anzaldúa talks about, uh, are all left behind. So it is in the aftermath of colonialism that we are able to look at this. And because Victorian age was creating the basic divide in gender, and here so much research has been done by Indian scholars on the fact that the patriarchal conventions according to which we live in India are basically not so Indian as much as they are given to us by our English masters, because they were very patriarchal in their assertions. And patriarchy is not about man and woman, it is about a kind of a classification of people into masters and slaves. So everywhere, the whites are the masters and the others are the slaves. In the home, the man is the master and the woman is the slave. So this master slave dichotomy is created in the colonial times due to race, due to caste, due to class, due to sex. And then we rediscover through race studies that in India also there is a lot of discrimination, and a whole lot of people find that they don't have a voice. They have been silenced by centuries of dominant discourse. And so we have Dalit studies. Now, in all this, the gender studies and feminist studies, I thought it's because this is the year of the suffragists. We are celebrating the getting of the vote in the 20s, 1920s by women who struggled for years to get power. So there are a huge lot of women authors, starting right from the 11th century, as you can see in this list, and coming up till the 16th century. A lot of women are religious, they are services and saints, but some of them are also women who are married and who are in charge of their families. So in the other, on the right hand side, there's Leonore Lopez de Cordoba, and she is the woman who writes the first memoir. She's writing what her experiences as a secular woman. So this division between religious literature and secular, which secular in the sense of non-religious, is also very important to note. Then, of course, in the 17th century, we have Ephra Bain, we have Elizabeth Carey, we have Cavendish Finch, up till Mary Roth. Then the great Mary Wollstonecraft, who in the Enlightenment age gave us the vindication of rights of women, saying that if everybody, all human beings have a mind and women have a mind, then why cannot we stand as equal to the men? Why should we be banished only to the private realm? And why are we treated like this? So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and her book on the plague, they are making headlines these days because they are so visionary and so eloquent of women's minds. Then, of course, in the 19th, late 18th and 19th, we have Jane Austen, and then the writings of the suffragists. That is another area that we can study. And one very important thing I learned was that the word suffragette is a term of abuse, and suffragists is the word which gives them their honor. They were called suffragettes by the men. It was like the suffrage. Suffrage is something for men. So here, these are these, starlets, these womenlets who want to be suffragettes. So the women want to call themselves suffragists, and we owe some homage to them. So now the major idea with which we are moving into the contemporary critical trends is the idea that from the ancient world or the classical world, we come with the idea of the ideal, the essence, the soul, And this soul or this ideal could be God, could be nature, could be that one idea that everybody holds very dear. And from there, because if ideal you, there is form, there is structure, there is language, and then we move to construct. We understand logocentrism. We understand that there is binarism. We understand there is categorization, and the race and ethnic studies that talk so much about the enlightenment and the education system, which was into categorizing people along, their physical attributes. What is your height? What is your skin color? What is your weight? And as a man, as a woman, if you are nearly 6 feet tall, that means you are like a man. So this kind of denigrating assessments were made during these times. From all this, through the works of Nietzsche, through the works of Rousseau, through the works of Kant, a rereading of them through Heidegger, Husserl, and all these philosophers, we have now come to a place where we are talking non-essentialism. We are talking about the post worlds, all the post, like the post-colonial, the post was the post here? No, it's in the next slide. So now we are not talking about any rigid ideas. We are not talking about fixed structures. We are talking about flexibility, fluidity, even in terms of sexuality. There can be no fixed sexuality, that heterosexuality is the norm. Then what sex you have, and then the idea that sex is biological, but gender, what about those who have mixed sexes, who have indeterminate sexual characteristics? So what do you call them? So gender becomes the all encompassing term. Then race, all these which are supposed to be fixed categories, now we are combating them and we are making them into changeable categories. It's not that we are making them, we understand that nothing is fixed, and that is all because of these philosophers who say that we have to now move from believing in one idea or one essence, which is the death of God, the idea of the death of God, into something which says that we have to move into an acceptance that life is fluid, things change, and whatever we believe today is just a set of ideological discourses that we have been fed. So let's not be fixated on them. And with that, we move into new movements. So the millennial literature turn is, as you can see, a lot of machine learning, graphic literature to do with digital. And there is optional and endless narrative. I write a line and I send the blog to somebody else, and they write another line, and your narrative just carries on. There is machine writing, there is artificial intelligence, speculative literature, which is something like science fiction, but going into fantasy. Then there are poem portraits. There are places like Magenta, there are blogs like Magenta, which are creating through AI, artificial intelligence. So millennial criticism, we have moved now in the 21st century towards, we've done all this post-humanism, post-feminism, post-racism, post-truth, the very truth that the philosophers were finding, that also has become non-essential. There can be no one truth. So postmodernism itself rests on the very basic idea that there can be no one truth. So if there are multiple truths, whose truth is the truth? So T, the capital T of truth, has been shown to the small t of post-truth. There are many, many truths. And so now even mythological studies, as Patnaik very famously says, there is objective truth and there is subjective truth, and myth is the subjective truth of a people. And objective truth is what is logocentrism, something that Plato and all were trying to establish, which was making the local universal. Their whole idea was to create a universal paradigm to which everybody could relate, and it has been a wonderful exercise. It's good to have very universal norms. So modernism was also creating universality, universal terms, like um, Lord Levi-Strauss was trying to, instructionalism, trying to find the common paradigms. Formalism, they were all trying to find the common formula, the common elements of narratives of different people. Through anthropology, they had discovered many people, but they found that the customs of many people had to do with, say, life, marriage, birth, marriage, death. So the only variation was in what people ate and what people did, which were also uh, related to the geographical conditions. So while there are certain universal things, all universal things are subject, absolutely subject to the local conditions. Even religion has come out of the local conditions of the people from where it has originated. So to make something which is born, say, in the Middle East, in a desert, and make it into a religion which can survive into the verdant green valley of say Germany, is a little difficult, because something which comes on in the desert, and if you stick to the word, the essence, that okay, you shall not have water, you shall only have wine. Obviously, in the desert, you're not going to find water. So you can have wine. I mean, you have to create water by the distillation of whatever crops are grown, whatever leaves, whatever green things you find. But that is not true of places which are river valley civilizations. They don't need that. So all religious customs are also subject to local conditions. So the great discovery of our times is that the global and the local meet. They must meet, they must interact, they must engage. And we must not have either or. We must not have binaries or divisions based on this is right or that is wrong. Everything is right in a particular time. It depends on the situation, on the positionality of the subject and the object. Then digital humanities. This is again an attempt to turn all humanities disciplines and digitalize text. So Hamlet has been digitalized. So many of these projects have been digitalized. So all this started, and now it has become a discipline. Many courses are offered on it. Medical humanities I find very interesting and fascinating, because it deals with the life experiences of a patient who's going through the pain and the suffering of any disease, and also the hardship suffered by the family. This is also socio-political in nature. So during the pandemic, for example, whatever we are facing, and the medical expenses undergoing, our whole lifestyle has changed, our thinking process is changing. All this can be studied under medical humanities, which again, a lot of courses are again being offered. Disability studies is coming out in a big way, queer studies, and the latest is we are expanding this horizon. So when you come out of fixed identities and move into fluid identities, when you allow that things are there to change, we have come from ancient times to the present times through a whole process of change, and we accept and embrace it, then we are better researchers, and we are more open to all kinds of things. So treating something which we don't understand as a disease or as an untruth, or like the witches are burnt at the stake because men could not stand women's power. So much so that Eliot also in his Prufrock says, he's also very afraid that women are asking for the vote. So if women come out of their homes, where will the men go? So like Prufrock, he says that I feel that my head is being sacrificed, like, on a platter using, and all of his wasteland, all of these things are a kind of a lament for the passing of a time when men were important. And if women take their place, what are we going to do? What are the men going to do? But the men are still there, and they're not all fighting. They're all having a very good time, because a lot of pressure has been taken off men when women have started taking responsibility for themselves. So there is a lot of beauty to be found in research based on an open mind and fluid methods. So, what are some of the future trends that we can look at for this? Of course, we are moving more and more from ecological to environmentalism, apocalyptic. Climate change studies is very, very important, and we need to now. These are all interdisciplinary areas, and it's a good thing for most students. So many students come from science and literature. They can keep connecting with their science and uh, study literature from that point of view. No, I didn't write the term diaspora studies, which is very interesting, and I'm sort of keep writing about it also. But new migration studies, because the pandemic has told us that diaspora, just as the Jews, diaspora societies are very fluid, very useful. But whenever there is a crisis, it's again the diaspora that are the fall guy. They are the ones who are first ones to be sacrificed. So we need to study in migration patterns. We need to study the idea of the separation of identity of migrants, the settled populations. We need to look at the socio-political impact. And one term written with Foucault was that when he was writing his theory, he's writing about how discourse creates a space of exclusion or inclusion. So discourse is created in which the like-minded or a particular class or the ruling class come together, and this discourse is made to keep the others out. So how nationalism is a discourse to create the others out, and how diaspora spaces studies is a space, is a kind of a discourse to break all the formalities at the border. People who are traveling too much don't want to face that. So once again, I'll go back to what I said in the beginning, that at any one time there are cross currents that are fighting against one another. While a sizable chunk of population of the world wants to move around and have free borders, a sizable chunk that stays at home wants security for themselves. And the pandemic has told us that when people travel, they not only bring new ideas and money and a lot of, say, perfumes from Europe, but they also bring the coronavirus. So, these are these things, these contrasts and these contestations go on. So I'm sure we are going to have pandemic studies a lot. This is a new research area. Now, capitalist criticism and global studies. There are lots of courses also going on this. So how far can capitalism be allowed to go? We have children who aspire to be in the corporate, and they're looking forward to that lovely six-digit salary that they're going to get over there. But what is at what cost? What are we losing when we are giving capitalists so much unrestrained power? As we can see, it's only the government everywhere that is able to sustain people. The private houses have sort of raised their hands and they're not doing anything. They always close upon themselves and save all the money and resources for themselves. Then gaming theory, because there's so many games going on, despite the bans, there are lots of games, and so we are going to have a lot of theory, I'm sure. My one major argument for research is that instead of looking at life in a narrow way, we should be more cosmopolitan in our outlook, despite being local, despite being global, and merging the term universal or global into the term cosmopolitan, in which we are at home wherever we are, at home or abroad, and we make others equally comfortable and at home. And this is what Kant had said at the beginning, that what is enlightenment doing and what is freedom doing? What is democracy doing? All these are trying to make the world a better home for human beings, a more friendly place for human beings to stay. So instead of excluding certain people from the resources of a country or the world, we must make a more inclusive world. So I would again like to contrast the modern concept of universalism, which was a very beautiful world-making project, in which Newton says that truth is ever to be found in simplicity and not in multiplicity and confusion of things. Today we say that there is multiplicity, is it? It is multiplicity which is everything. If you try to break multiplicity and try to make it into one, you're going to do a lot of damage. So it is only when all the colors remain that you will also have a white color, in the end. It is not, if you keep breaking all the other colors, something will be lost and the white will never be that pure. So we need a multiplicity of visions, dreams, and prophecies. And these are all the number of people that we have, the number of perspectives that we have, all will give us more potential tomorrows. Now, wabi sabi is a Japanese term. I'm sure you've all heard it, which has to do with imperfection. It acknowledges that the world can never be a perfect place. So I thought it was a perfect way to say that instead of that one ideal for which man is always, going and finding himself wanting, because of which all human enterprise seems to end in some kind of suffering and violence and war. Let's all agree that we are all in a process. We are all in a process of making. The whole world is in a process of making, and so there are going to be imperfections. And things like aging is also beautiful. Things like youth is also beautiful. And let's enjoy the world together. Thank you. I'm sure I've taken
Thank
more.
you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insight in the world of literary criticism. I'm sure our scholars and the teachers have learned a lot from today's session. Now, I'd like to the participants to raise their questions. They can either switch on their mics or can write in the chat box. Any questions?
If I have not raised any questions, it's been a useless session.
I would like to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Ma'am, don't you think it is all because of World War One and Two that existentialism came into existence? Had there been no
Yes.
world wars, perhaps there would have been no philosophy like existentialism. Do you think it has any role to play in this?
Of course, of course. It was, I think I did mention it very briefly. The whole point is that the World War One is the time around World War One is the time of the rise of modernism, and modernism is not just coming up because of the World War. It is coming because as a backlash to Victorianism. And then at the same time, democratic forces are happening, imperial forces are happening, and there are these clashes between European powers over colonies. So world wars are inevitable. I mean, my emphasis was on the fact that there are forces in the world which keep moving, which keep creating currents of thought, currents of movement, and all of them seem to come together. But existentialism seemed to demonstrate to them that the God in whom we all believe, that we should just do our duty and pray to Him, and God will save us. That faith was shaken. So waiting for Godot as the existential text sort of tells us that we have to help ourselves. So that is a very powerful moment in which we realize that not because we are, it's not hubris. It's not to say that we are arrogant. It is that God has let us into the world. And, in Christian theology, the idea of determinism and free will is always there. So how much free will we have to act and how much our fate is determined. So existentialism is now sort of saying that it is a deterministic universe. We cannot do much except, like Sisyphus, keep rolling the stone up and then wait for it to roll down. So it is a very desperate kind of a moment of disillusion. But this moment itself, existentialism itself, helps to break that that essentialism. It helps us to look beyond that one idea, or any one idea, to many ideas, to multiplicity, which gives us postmodernism.
You're right, ma'am. You're right.
Ma'am, there's a question for you. Kindly give some ideas about new trends in literature like cultural studies and eco-criticism. This
Yes,
question has
yes,
been raised by Jisha.
yes. I had briefly mentioned cultural studies. Yes, see, cultural studies comes with post-structuralism, and it is the idea that the text and the context in post-structuralism. I was talking about it, but I thought, let me not elaborate upon it. I'm glad now I'm being asked this. As I said, that formal structures, text is very important. What is the written word? But for some people, the context was never so important. Like modernism also is more about literariness. Formalism is also more about literariness. And then we have, the coming of the post-structural thinking, which says very clearly that we are constructs of language. So when we are constructs of language, it is in our language itself that the text and the context come together. So famously, the author is dead. That is the idea of intertextuality, that anything that one is writing is not original. Everything that we know is coming from some text or the other. Secondly, this idea that the whole world is a text. So when Derrida says there is nothing outside the text, he means everything is readable, everything is researchable, everything can be broken up into its parts, and everything can be studied. So cultural studies has made it possible for us to study events. So we can study a marriage party as an event, as a text, and we can break it up into parts. And so cultural studies is, of course, very important because it is, some people see it as a challenge to literature, but I mean, I see it as a kind of, again, a multiple approach. You are now, because literature is not about reading and writing, we have moved into digital platforms, and it is again into more about speaking and performance. Literature has also become more performative again. So in that sense, cultural studies is going to take the best of all the literary methodologies, put it all together.
Ma'am, there's another question from Parul Bhateja. She has asked about books on literary criticism which are easy to understand for the students. Most of the books, even I feel, in literary criticism, are very difficult to understand. The language is very difficult. So she's asking for a book that is an easy read, basically.
The easiest read for this is criticism.
Yes, ma'am.
The easiest read, I feel, I mean, a very wholesome book is Habib. No, have you got that?
Um, Ma'am, can you please repeat the name? Your voice was breaking.
The entire
Ma'am, you're not audible.
history of. Okay. MAR. Shall I write it in the chat box then? MAR Habib.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. That would be great. Also, Parul Bhateja, she wants your mail ID, ma'am. So if you're okay to share with her
Yes, yes, yes. It's my name at Gmail.
your mail ID,
Running Nina
mail
Guptavich.
ID.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just put in the chat box.
Okay. And then there is Ananya Banerjee. She has requested you to say something on the fourth wave of the feminist theory with reference to the Indian critics.
Please repeat that. I was typing, so I didn't catch that.
Um, Sorry, ma'am. She has Ananya Banerjee has asked you to talk about the fourth wave of feminist theory, especially with reference to the Indian critics.
Yes, yes. I missed that out because I wanted to just, bring the thread together. Yeah, the Indian ethos is very different. In fact, I wanted to mention Indian aesthetics and the Indian cultural studies as a separate norm. We need to study the Indian cultural studies away from the Western norm. But I myself haven't done much work on it. But the Indian, feminism is sort of it is more in indigenous, more indigenous studies, like we have Mahashweta Devi, who's written about the tribals and how she's brought out the women. So the critics, the critics are not as effective as the writers themselves. The writers themselves are the critics. So the more Indian women that you read, authors that you read, the more insight you will get, even with the Western tools. So what Mahashweta Devi is doing, and what Vandana Shiva has done with ecology, trying to bring attention to, and if you connect this with Margaret Atwood and the way she looks at feminism and ecological, so the fourth wave. See, after post feminism, when we are moving into this wave, as I said, there are so many cross currents. And at one thing, what you call simultaneity, there's a term called simultaneity. Even at one given time in history, there are diachronic and synchronic paradigms. We know that. But even at one time, there are so many diachronic elements which have been existing since time. So the fourth wave is also just a kind of realization that all parts of the world are not homogeneous. The growth or the evolution of freedom and the restrictions are not uniform. So when I was using the word universal, I meant a little in the term of homogeneous. We cannot say that everywhere things are the same, because everywhere the conditions are not the same, everywhere the cultures are not the same, everywhere the numbers are not the same, the kind of governments are not the same, the kind of people are not the same. So with the kind of world that we have and the kind of access we have to world news, we have things like the Me Too movement, and we have people like George Floyd being killed, and many women are now, that is so when feminism is also looking, I mean, the third wave also disagreed, the second wave disagreed with white feminism. Fourth wave, again, we are understanding that the male, the weak male, the societies in which even the male is feminized and violated, that is also part of feminist studies. That is also part of feminist studies, because it's not about male or female. It is about the marginalized. It is about people who have left out from the voice of history, who are invisible in history, and they come under subaltern studies. So we have women who say that we want everything. We want marriage, freedom, fashion, education, and the desire to control our own bodies, total. We subjects of ourselves and subjects of our bodies. And yet we have women who know that it's not possible for many populations of the world. And so many times it is cultural constraints which are keeping women chained, to their desperations. So um, my suggestion, or the way I look at things, is that whenever you're doing an in-depth study, you have to understand the particular author and understand the positionality of the author before you look at the methodology or the approach that you will use.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. There is another question from Shally. She wants some good books on aesthetics and Dalit writing. Any good book that you can suggest, ma'am, on aesthetics and Dalit writing?
On aesthetics, I can't, but I can send it to you. I can send it to Shubhra or somebody. I can't just off the cuff, say it, because I'm not really working on it right now. But I have come across a lot of authors who are writing. There are Dalit feminist studies. There is a reader, the Dalit feminist reader has come up, and there are a lot of studies. But I'll let you know. I'll send them. Uh,
Okay,
Dr.
thank you so
Shubhra,
much,
please
ma'am.
remind
I'll
me.
try to contact you
Yeah.
in your mail ID. Thank you.
Yes, please do.
Ma'am,
Please do.
there is
Hello,
another
Nina ma'am.
question. Can you
I have a question for you. Hi, Nina ma'am.
Hello, Abhimanyu. How nice to see you. Yes, yes, I
Yeah,
can see
ma'am.
you.
After a long time indeed.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Ma'am, I have a question to you. I have been glued to your presentation since the very beginning, since I saw that you are there as a resource person. I was very happy. Ma'am, I have a question. I wanted to talk about feminism, but you have rightly put across that these days feminism is not about women being victimized. It is there are women who create victims also. So that is also true. However, since you are in university and since you are taking care of humanity department that is into English literature, why at the research at the university front is only focused on the victimization of women in novels? When you come to the practical ground, there is victimization of men by the women also. Why such subjects are not taken into feminism, where the confidence of the faculty lacks to take up such topic and bring forth the reality? Talking about the books, talking about some quotes, Helen Sikku has already said long ago in 1980s. She has said women in Laugh of Medusa that women is against women. So when in India, in Indian society, in Indian culture, we are going to see this perspective. So my question is why research at this level, at this front, is lacking in Indian scenario of education system? Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, nothing is lacking, Abhimanyu. Everything is going on. And while our own department may not have done any work, or maybe some people over here haven't done this work, lots and lots of people are working on this. But let me again and again tell you what I believe is, it's not about male, female, it's not about sex, it's not about the body, it's about power relations. Everything is about power relations, as Foucault says. And so, whether it is a woman, if she finds that she is in a dominant role or in a dominant position, obviously it is the male who will have to suffer. But mostly what we are now fighting at, even in the fourth wave of feminism, we still find that patriarchal assumptions, and the society is so interpolated by patriarchy that even women don't know that they are siding with patriarchy, which is not men. Patriarchy doesn't mean men. Patriarchy means a system which tries to make men behave in a certain way and make
Hmm.
women behave in a certain way. So patriarchy is equally cruel to men. So
Yes.
men are not able to come out and say honestly that they are not like this. So I have a lot of students, I have a lot of friends who belong to the LGBTQ community. I have a lot of people, but because of the patriarchal assertion that you have to be heteronormative, that you cannot be unsuited for marriage, I have many friends who come with broken relationships. Their male or female partner has left them because the family says you must get married, and so that male or female has married somebody else and ruined their life, ruined the life of their marriage partner, and ruined the life of their, the whom
It
they love.
also, yeah.
So these cultural, so patriarchy is a system which is also violating the earth, the planet, because it says that man is in control and the person with the maximum resources is the leader. That's what we say. If we change that paradigm, And we say, let's say, we say in the Indian way. Some people say that it's the Indian way, but again, it's not the universal Indian way. Only certain texts in India say that let men and women and everybody be in a humbler position to nature or to earth or to the resources. So, in a similar way, if man is left, like sexuality is not an idea that you have to be married only to a woman or a woman has to be married to a man, then you see so much of suffering will be over. But certain rules have been made in certain conditions, keeping a historical condition in mind, keeping a geographical reality in mind, keeping a cultural condition in mind. And despite having so much freedom, which incidentally urbanism is bringing us, democracy is bringing us, technology is bringing us so much freedom, yet we are afraid to break away from that only because we don't have the courage to say that, okay, I am like this and I am normal. I'm not abnormal. So even women, I remember when we get married, we take a lot of pride in saying that I'm very happy with my husband, because if I say I'm not unhappy, that means there's something wrong with me. So till now, I'm in my 50s and I look at my husband and tell everybody my husband is a wonderful person. Till they meet him. No, he's a wonderful person. But I'm just saying that till somebody meets him, they'll say कि अच्छा आप तो बहुत ऐसे बोलती हो, but okay, yes, he is or he's not. So we tend to glorify that because we are brought up like that we cannot denigrate. So this is all patriarchy. We have to learn to be more honest and integrated. We must have a personal integrity, the courage to go against the tide. Why don't we go against it? Because economically we are not free. Sometimes culturally we are so claustrophobic that we don't know what to do. Yes, but you're right. These things need to be studied. More texts need to be read. And I am in autobiographical studies, and I find that more than fiction, perhaps autobiographical narratives will help. If people are more, honest about their own experiences, maybe more study can be done, more honest study can be done.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I tend to speak too much. Please stop me
No, ma'am,
when
it's
I'm.
tired listening to you always. Don't say that.
No, but time is there. Na? I mean, the next speaker is also there.
Okay,
Now, a quick last question from Devi Meenakshi. She has asked whether we can compare Dalit literature with Afro American literature.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Though again, I'll say that let's not make it reductive. Let's not make it oversimple. Different conditions, different historical paradigms, what we call diachronic conditions, have created different kind of positions in the world. But that does not mean that those positions should remain static. That is precisely the point. That once upon a time, if the world held some ideas to be very dear, and those ideas are no longer tenable, or you find that a new idea has come, as I said, with modernity, with modernism, the most beautiful idea is that the world is going to be a true home for everybody. So a home is a place where you feel safe, secure, and happy. So whether it's a male or a female, an Afro-American or a white European or a Dalit or a person from an upper class, a woman, whoever, or a gay or lesbian or any community, they should all feel comfortable here. So the idea of academia is to create that kind of, it's academia that has created this space, has brought us from that one idea essence to non-essential. So it is our job to take that idea further, and not just take the idea further, to live that reality. So inclusion. So now Africans have been on the basis of race. So race studies is a little different. Nevertheless, there is a new book, in fact, I'm forgetting the author. I should have remembered her, but Oprah Winfrey has also promoted her. So she has said that in the US, she says, caste is the problem in our destiny, something like that. So it's an African American who's calling herself not a racial victim, but she's saying it is akin to caste only, just as caste operates in certain South Asian societies, especially India. Similarly, in America, race also acts as a kind of a caste in which you do not want to have anything to do with it. You want to brush it under the carpet. And in fact, we have academic people, professors and vice chancellors, who say when we say casteism, we write casteism as one of the ills of India. They say, why do you want to showcase the bad things? Why don't you showcase the good things? I said, sir, we have to bring out all these things from under the carpet so that we can work on them. If we keep sweeping them under the carpet all the time, then who's going to work on them? So yes, you're right. And African, in fact, the black race studies and black writers like Du Bois and Fano and all have given us a whole lot of work. In fact, there was a seminar, a conference in about 30, 40 years back in the US, in which the Dalits and the African Americans have come together to create a kind of an association. Yeah, am I audible?
Ma'am, your voice was breaking in between.
I'm sorry, I don't know. I thought the connection is good, but am I audible now?
Yeah, ma'am, just the last part was great.
Was it? I mean, have I answered the question?
Yes, ma'am, you have. Thank you so much, ma'am.